The rain in Blackwood Valley never felt like life. It felt like decay. It slicked the slate roof of the old Harrison Manor, making the grand estate look like a dying beast sinking into the mud. Inside, the atmosphere was no warmer. Clara stood in the corner of the mahogany-paneled study, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She was 24, but the last 3 years of caring for her ailing grandfather, Silas Harrison, had etched a quiet exhaustion into her eyes. Silas had been a man of immense wealth, built from decades of land acquisition and timber mills. Now that he was gone, the vultures had arrived. Across the room sat her uncles, Julian and Marcus, alongside their elegant, sharp-tongued wives. They hadn't visited Silas once during his long illness. They hadn't contributed a single dime to his medical bills, leaving Clara to drain her own meager savings. Yet here they were, smelling of expensive cologne and desperation, eyeing the leather-bound ledger on the lawyer's desk. Mr. Vance, the family's lifelong attorney, cleared his throat. The room fell instantly silent. "We are here to execute the final will and testament of Silas Vance Harrison," the lawyer announced, adjusting his spectacles. Per his strict instructions, the estate is to be divided immediately, with no room for contestation. Julian leaned forward, his gold watch catching the dim light. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Vance. We all know why we're here. The manor, the commercial blocks downtown, and the liquid accounts. How are they split?" Mr. Vance sighed, a sound heavy with professional disappointment. "To Julian and Marcus Harrison, your father leaves the entirety of the Harrison timber holdings, the downtown commercial properties, the main manor, and all associated financial portfolios to be divided equally." A collective, breathless sigh of relief rippled through the uncles and their wives. They smiled, crooked, victorious smiles. "And what of Clara?" Marcus asked, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "She did play nursemaid for quite a while. Surely father left her a token?" Mr. Vance looked at Clara, his eyes filled with genuine pity. "To Clara Montgomery, daughter of my late daughter Eleanor, Silas leaves the parcel of land known as Sector 7, the abandoned northern boundary plot, including the defunct stone well located at its center. This property is transferred to her absolute ownership effective immediately." Julian burst into a harsh, barking laugh. "Sector 7, that rocky barren strip of dirt near the ravine? The one with the dried-up well from the 1800s. "That is correct," Mr. Vance said quietly. "How fitting," Marcus's wife whispered loudly. "The martyr gets the dirt, while we rebuild the empire." Clara felt a cold numbness wash over her. She didn't care about the mansions or the millions, but the sheer cruelty of the exclusion stung. She had given up her youth to hold her grandfather's hand while he coughed blood, while these men were vacationing in Europe. "Is this acceptable to you, Clara?" Mr. Vance asked, his voice gentle. Clara looked at her uncles. They were already whispering about listing the manor for sale. They didn't see her. They never had. She straightened her spine, swallowed the lump of glass in her throat and nodded. "It is acceptable," Clara said, her voice steady. "Give me the deed." The following morning, Clara stood in the middle of Sector 7. The uncles hadn't even given her 24 hours to pack her things from the main house. Julian had sent 2 burly movers to place her suitcases on the porch at dawn. With nowhere else to go, and her bank account sitting at a double-digit balance, she had driven her battered sedan out to the northern boundary. Sector 7 was a miserable stretch of land. It was choked with thorny briars, jagged limestone outcroppings, and dead grey trees that looked like skeletal hands reaching out of the earth. No crop could grow here, no developer would buy it. And there, in the dead center of a clearing, sat the old well. Clara discovers that her grandfather did not just leave her a dry well out of neglect. Tucked into the rusted iron crank of the well is a final handwritten note from Silas that reads, "To Clara, who gave me everything, dig deep enough, and the earth will always return what is stolen." This realization changes her perspective. The inheritance wasn't a punishment, but a hidden riddle. Clara walked closer, her boots crunching on the dried twigs. The well was ancient, constructed of heavy, moss-covered river stones held together by crumbling mortar. A rotting wooden canopy overhung it, and a thick, rusted iron chain dangled into the pitch-black abyss below. She unhitched the note from the crank. Her grandfather's handwriting was shaky, written in the final days of his delirium. "Dig deep enough, and the earth will always return what is stolen." "What did you do, grandfather?" she whispered, looking down into the dark opening. She dropped a small pebble into the well. She waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Instead of the hollow clack of stone hitting dry earth, there was a muffled metallic thud. It wasn't deep. The well had been boarded up or filled in midway down. Clara looked back at her car, where her entire life was packed into 3 cardboard boxes. She had no money, no home, and no family left. All she had was a piece of paper declaring her the owner of a broken stone hole. "Fine," she muttered, tying her hair back into a determined knot. "Let's see what you left me." Clara spent the next 3 days living out of a small pop-up tent she pitched near the edge of the woods. The weather had cleared, replaced by a humid, oppressive heat that made physical labor grueling. Armed with a heavy iron crowbar, a flashlight, and a pair of thick leather work gloves she found in her car trunk, she began evaluating the well. The structure was solid, but about 12 feet down, a thick platform of heavy oak timbers blocked the shaft. It looked deliberate, installed decades ago to prevent anything, or anyone, from going further. The wood was old but dry, protected from the elements by the stone canopy. She rigged a battery-powered lantern to a rope and lowered it down, leaning over the edge to inspect the barrier. "If this was just an old, broken well, you wouldn't have reinforced it with 3-inch thick oak, grandfather," she murmured. Using a makeshift pulley system she constructed from the old iron chain and a sturdy branch above, she managed to lower herself down into the cramped stone cylinder. The air inside smelled of cold stone, copper, and ancient dust. As Clara hammers at the oak timbers with her crowbar, she realizes the wood isn't rotten from water but preserved by heavy coats of oil. When she finally breaks through a section, she expects to find water or empty air. Instead, she finds a vacuum-sealed chamber containing a massive vintage iron vault door built directly into the bedrock floor of the well. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She wiped the sweat and dust from her forehead, staring down through the shattered wood. Beneath the timber platform lay a flat, dark iron surface. It wasn't part of the well's construction. It was an industrial-grade vault door, the kind used by banks in the late 19th century, set horizontally into the very foundation of the valley. A heavy brass wheel sat in the center of the iron door, covered in a thick layer of grease. She reached down, her hands shaking, and grasped the wheel. She threw her weight into it, turning it counterclockwise. It didn't budge. The metal was locked tight, frozen by time and a heavy internal mechanism. Suddenly a shadow fell over the opening of the well. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up toward the circle of daylight 12 feet above. A figure was standing at the edge, blocking the sun. Well, look what we have here. The little orphan is playing in the dirt." The voice belonged to Julian. Clara's muscles tensed. She carefully pulled her flashlight back into her jacket pocket, hiding the light, and began climbing the iron chain until she hauled herself out of the well's mouth. Julian was standing there wearing an immaculate linen suit that looked absurd against the dusty landscape of Sector 7. Behind him, a massive yellow bulldozer sat idling at the edge of the property line, its engine rumbling like a sleeping beast. "What are you doing here, Julian?" Clara asked, wiping dirt onto her jeans. "I could ask you the same thing," Julian said, looking around the barren plot with undisguised disgust. The family lawyers realized there was a clerical error in the boundary description. Sector 7 actually overlaps with the timber yard we're expanding. "I'm here to clear these trees and level this plot. The deed is in my name," Clara said, stepping between him and the well. "Mr. Vance signed it over. It doesn't overlap with anything. This is my land." Julian took a step closer, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Listen to me, girl. You got what you deserved, nothing. Don't get arrogant because you own a few square meters of rocks. I can tie you up in court for the next 10 years until you're completely bankrupt. Sell me this plot for $500. Take your tents and get out of our sight." Julian notices the crowbar and the ropes leading into the well. Realizing Clara has found something, his demeanor shifts from arrogant dismissal to aggressive suspicion. He orders his bulldozer operator to prepare to bulldoze the well immediately, forcing Clara to stand directly in front of the machine to protect her discovery. "Get off my property, Julian," Clara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She didn't move an inch. "If that bulldozer touches a single stone on this plot, I'm calling the state police and filing for a criminal injunction before your lawyer can even wake up from his nap." Julian stared at her, his face turning a mottled red. He looked at the well, then back at Clara's defiant expression. He knew she had nothing left to lose, which made her dangerous. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Julian sneered, waving his hand to signal the bulldozer operator to shut down the engine. "Enjoy your rocks, Clara. But remember, this county belongs to us now. You won't find a single person willing to help you out here." He turned on his heel and stormed back toward his luxury SUV, leaving the bulldozer parked right at the edge of her property line like a silent threat. Clara knew her time was running out. If Julian suspected there was something of value on Sector 7, he wouldn't hesitate to use illegal means to seize it. She needed to open that vault door, and she needed to do it tonight. But she didn't have the combination or the key. She sat in her car, staring at the handwritten note from her grandfather. "Dig deep enough, and the earth will always return what is stolen." "The earth will return what is stolen," she repeated. Why did he use the word stolen? Silas Harrison had built his fortune during the economic crashes of the mid-20th century, but the Harrison family history went back much further, to the old frontier days. There were rumors that the original Harrison wealth hadn't been earned through timber, but through something far more controversial. Clara realized she needed more information. She drove down to the local library, a small brick building that held the town's historical archives. Because her uncles were currently busy renovating the main manor, they hadn't yet touched the old historical records kept in the library's basement. Clara spent hours poring over old microfilms, local newspapers from the 1890s, and family journals. Clara discovers a forgotten 1894 newspaper article detailing a massive train robbery where a shipment of federal gold reserves vanished near Blackwood Valley. The primary suspect was their great-great-grandfather, Elias Harrison. But the gold was never recovered, and the case was dropped due to lack of evidence. The location of the suspect's original homestead. Sector 7. Clara's heart raced as she read the yellowed text on the screen. The original well hadn't been built for water. It had been built over the foundations of Elias Harrison's hidden bunker. Tucked into the back of an old family ledger stored in the archive, Clara found a series of coordinates and a string of numbers written in a margin: 94, 18, 06. The date of the robbery was September 4th, 1894. Could it be that simple? She whispered. She checked her watch. It was 9 p.m. The sky was pitch black, and a thunderstorm was rolling in over the valley. It was the perfect cover. Clara returned to Sector 7 under the cover of a torrential downpour. Thunder rattled the trees as she lowered herself back down into the well, her flashlight beam cutting through the damp darkness. She stood on the iron vault door, the rain dripping from her hair onto the cold metal. She cleared away the grease from the brass wheel, revealing a dial with numerical markings. Her hands trembled from the cold and adrenaline. She turned the dial to the right, stopping exactly at 94. She turned it to the left, winding past 0 to 18. She turned it back to the right, landing on Y6. For a second, nothing happened. The only sound was the howling wind outside the well's mouth. Then deep within the bedrock, a series of heavy metallic clicks resonated through the stone. The brass wheel spun freely under her hands. When the vault door swings open, it doesn't reveal a chest of gold, but a steep stone staircase leading into a vast subterranean cavern system carved directly beneath the entire Harrison estate. The air inside is remarkably fresh, indicating a complex, hidden ventilation system connected to the valley's cave network. Clara gripped her flashlight tightly and began her descent. The air grew warmer as she walked down the stone steps. The walls were reinforced with old timber beams, structurally sound, despite being over a century old. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, her flashlight illuminated a massive vaulted chamber. It wasn't just a hiding place, it was a museum of secrets. Along the walls stood rows of heavy iron trunks, old mining equipment, and shelves filled with thousands of leather-bound documents. Clara walked toward the nearest iron trunk. It was unlocked. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, stacked in neat, shimmering rows, were hundreds of heavy bars of gold, each stamped with the U.S. Federal Reserve seal from 1894. But as she looked past the gold, her eyes fell on a large wooden desk in the center of the room. On it sat a modern leather binder with a note attached to it in her grandfather's distinct handwriting. For Clara, the truth shall set you free and destroy them. Clara opened the modern binder. Inside were not historical documents, but recent financial statements, bank routing numbers, and corporate ledgers belonging to her uncles Julian and Marcus. As she read through the pages, the true horror of her family's operations came to light. Her grandfather Silas hadn't lost his mind in his final years. He had discovered that Julian and Marcus were systematically embezzling millions from the family timber company. They were laundering money through offshore accounts and intentionally falsifying corporate tax records to bankrupt the estate before Silas could pass it down. More terrifyingly, they had deliberately altered Silas's medical records. They kept him on high dosages of sedatives to make him appear incompetent so they could seize control of his assets early. Clara finds the original, unedited will of Silas Harrison inside the vault. It reveals that Silas had left the entire fortune, the manor and the companies to Clara, knowing her uncles were corrupt. The will her uncles used to claim the inheritance was a sophisticated forgery manufactured by Mr. Vance, who had been blackmailed by Julian. Clara stood in the quiet chamber, tears of anger burning her eyes. Her grandfather hadn't abandoned her. He had been trapped, surrounded by monsters, and this vault was his final chess move to ensure she had the weapons to destroy them. Suddenly, a loud, echoing click reverberated from the top of the stone staircase. "Fascinating," a voice echoed down the tunnel. Clara spun around, her flashlight beam catching a figure walking down the stairs. It wasn't Julian. It was Mr. Vance, the attorney. He held a sleek black revolver in his hand, his face devoid of the grandfatherly warmth he had feigned just days before. "I must admit, Clara, I didn't think you'd figure it out so quickly," Vance said, his voice smooth and cold. "Silas always said you were the brightest of the bunch. A pity you inherited his stubbornness as well." Clara stepped back against the wooden desk, keeping her hands visible. "You changed the will, Vance. You helped them poison my grandfather." "Poison is such an ugly word," Vance said, stopping at the base of the stairs, keeping his distance. "Let's call it chemical management. Julian and Marcus are fools, of course. They think they run this town. They don't realize I've been pulling their strings for 20 years. But they were useful for getting rid of your grandfather." "Why leave me Sector 7 then?" Clara asked, trying to keep him talking while her mind raced for an escape route. "Because Silas insisted on it during a brief moment of lucidity before we could stop him," Vance explained, gesturing toward the gold. "He managed to record the deed transfer directly with the state registry, bypassing my office. I didn't know this was down here, though. I thought it was just an old man's sentimental attachment to a useless plot of land." Vance's eyes scanned the rows of gold bars, a greedy glint appearing in his gaze. "A federal gold shipment from 1894, worth hundreds of millions at today's prices. Plus the original will. This changes things. Vance reveals that he has no intention of sharing this discovery with Julian or Marcus. He informs Clara that he has already wired anonymous tips to the federal authorities framing her uncles for corporate fraud, and plans to eliminate Clara tonight, collapse the well, and extract the gold himself over the coming months. "You won't get away with this, Vance," Clara said, her fingers quietly feeling around the desk behind her back, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. "The storm outside is severe. People know I'm out here. No one knows you're here, Clara. To the world, you're just a grieving broke girl living in a tent who unfortunately succumbed to the elements during a flash flood," Vance said. He raised the revolver, aligning the sight directly with her chest. "Goodbye, my dear." Clara's hand closed around a heavy, rusted iron paperweight on the desk. Just as Vance squeezed his finger around the trigger, a deafening explosion of thunder shook the entire cavern. The structural timber beams groaned, and a shower of dust fell from the ceiling, momentarily distracting the lawyer. Clara threw her body to the left just as the gun fired. The gunshot was blindingly loud in the enclosed cavern. The bullet shattered the wooden desk right where Clara had been standing a second before. Clara didn't hesitate. She threw the heavy iron paperweight directly at Vance's face. It struck him square in the shoulder, knocking him off balance and causing him to drop his flashlight. The chamber plunged into partial darkness, illuminated only by Clara's dropped flashlight on the floor. Clara sprinted past him, heading straight for the stone staircase. "You little brat!" Vance roared, firing blindly into the dark behind her. A bullet chipped the stone wall near her ear, spraying her with sharp fragments. Clara scrambled up the steep stone steps, her lungs burning, her heart pounding like a war drum. She reached the top of the stairs, hauled herself through the iron vault opening, and emerged into the freezing, pouring rain inside the well shaft. She grabbed the iron chain and began climbing frantically toward the circle of stormy sky above. As Clara climbs out of the well, Vance reaches the bottom of the shaft and begins firing upward. However, the torrential rain has caused a massive flash flood across Sector 7. A wall of muddy water rushes into the well, opening from the surface, completely flooding the bottom chamber and trapping Vance inside the subterranean labyrinth as the old timbers begin to fail. Clara dragged herself over the stone lip of the well, collapsing onto the mud, gasping for air. Behind her, the well was roaring like an active volcano. Thousands of gallons of rainwater were cascading down the shaft, creating a terrifying whirlpool. She could hear Vance's distant, muffled screams of panic from deep within the earth as the ancient structure began to give way under the immense water pressure. She looked up through the blinding rain. Through the sheets of water, she saw the headlights of a car approaching down the dirt track of Sector 7. It was Julian's SUV. The SUV screeched to a halt just feet from her tent. Julian stepped out into the pouring rain, holding a heavy iron flashlight. His face was pale, his hair disheveled. He looked like a man whose world was actively collapsing. "Clara!" he yelled over the sound of the thunder. "Where is Vance?" "His car is parked down the road. The feds just raided the main manor. They have warrants for my arrest and Marcus's bank accounts have been frozen." "What did you do?" Clara slowly stood up from the mud. She was covered in dirt, blood, and rainwater. But for the first time in her life, she felt completely unbroken. "I didn't do anything, Julian," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the storm. "Grandfather did. He knew exactly what you were." Julian ran toward her, grabbing her by the jacket collar. "Where is the money? The lawyer said Silas had a secret reserve. Vance knew about it. Tell me where it is or I swear to God." Clara doesn't flinch. She points to the idling bulldozer that Julian had left at the edge of her property line. She informs Julian that the evidence of his entire corporate fraud, along with the original will that completely strips him of his inheritance, is safe in a secure digital cloud backup she uploaded from the archive files before coming here. If he touches her, the files go live to every major news outlet in the state. Julian froze, his hand trembling as he held her collar. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The helpless niece he had spent years dismissing was now holding his entire life in her hands. "You're bluffing," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Try me," Clara said, her eyes cold and unwavering. "Your empire is gone, Julian. By morning, you and Marcus won't even own the clothes on your backs. Now get your hands off me." Slowly, Julian's fingers uncurled. He stepped back, looking at her as if she were a stranger. She was a terrifying force of nature, born from the very mud of the land he despised. Suddenly, a deep, rumbling groan shook the ground beneath their feet. The ground around the old stone well began to sag. The massive influx of water, combined with the structural damage from the gunshot, had triggered a catastrophic collapse of the old 1894 bunker system. "What is that?" Julian yelled, stumbling backward as the limestone beneath his boots cracked. "Run!" Clara shouted. She turned and sprinted toward the safety of the outer tree line, where the bedrock was stable. Julian, blinded by greed, didn't follow her immediately. He ran toward the edge of the well, trying to see what was hidden inside before it vanished forever. The entire stone structure of the well suddenly implodes inward, swallowing the stone canopy, the ancient chain, and a massive 30-foot radius of earth around it into a giant sinkhole. Julian manages to dive backward just in time, but his luxury SUV is dragged into the abyss, disappearing into the subterranean depths along with Mr. Vance and the secret chamber. Clara watched from the safety of the ridge as the dust and water settled. The old well was gone. It was replaced by a deep, muddy crater filled with swirling runoff water. The gold, the old documents, and the corrupt attorney were buried under millions of tons of collapsed limestone and earth. They were sealed away forever by the valley itself. Julian lay in the mud, sobbing openly, his spirit completely broken. He had lost his money, his freedom, and his family legacy in a single night. Clara turned her back on him. She walked over to her battered sedan, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. She had work to do. The ground around the old stone well began to sag. The massive influx of water, combined with the structural damage from the gunshot, had triggered a catastrophic collapse of the old 1894 bunker system. "What is that?" Julian yelled, stumbling backward as the limestone beneath his boots cracked. "Run!" Clara shouted. She turned and sprinted toward the safety of the outer tree line, where the bedrock was stable. Julian, blinded by greed, didn't follow her immediately. He ran toward the edge of the well, trying to see what was hidden inside before it vanished forever. The entire stone structure of the well suddenly implodes inward, swallowing the stone canopy, the ancient chain, and a massive 30-foot radius of earth around it into a giant sinkhole. Julian manages to dive backward just in time, but his luxury SUV is dragged into the abyss, disappearing into the subterranean depths along with Mr. Vance in the secret chamber. Clara watched from the safety of the ridge as the dust and water settled. The old well was gone. It was replaced by a deep, muddy crater filled with swirling runoff water. The gold, the old documents, and the corrupt attorney were buried under millions of tons of collapsed limestone and earth. They were sealed away forever by the valley itself. Julian lay in the mud, sobbing openly, his spirit completely broken. He had lost his money, his freedom, and his family legacy in a single night. Clara turned her back on him. She walked over to her battered sedan, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. She had work to do. 3 months later, the sun was shining brightly over Blackwood Valley, casting a warm golden glow across a transformed landscape. Sector 7 was no longer a barren wasteland of briars and rocks. Heavy machinery was moving across the property, but they weren't clearing trees for a timber yard. They were laying the foundations for a massive, state-of-the-art agricultural research center and community park. Clara stood on the observation deck of a beautiful new modern building constructed near the edge of the property. She wore a tailored suit, her hair neatly styled, looking every bit the CEO she had become. The legal battle had been swift and absolute. Using the original documents and evidence she had secured before the collapse, the courts had declared the forged will invalid. Julian and Marcus had been stripped of every asset. They were currently serving 15-year sentences in a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny. While the main gold vault was destroyed in the collapse, Clara reveals to a visiting Mr. Vance's replacement attorney that she had actually hauled up 2 heavy leather satchels of federal gold coins and the definitive original deed to the entire Harrison corporate empire during her first ascent up the well chain, meaning her current multi-million-dollar venture was funded completely legally by her grandfather's true inheritance. Clara looked down at the center of the new park. In the exact spot where the old, broken well had once stood, a beautiful, modern architectural fountain had been constructed. The water cascaded over elegant tiers of smooth river stone, sparkling in the afternoon light. At the base of the fountain was a bronze plaque dedicated to the memory of Silas Harrison. Clara opens a safety deposit box delivered to her on her 25th birthday, a timed delivery set by her grandfather years ago. Inside is a final tape recording where Silas explains that he always knew his sons would try to destroy him, and he intentionally used the old well as a crucible to test Clara's strength, knowing that only a woman who survived the dirt could properly rule the empire. Clara smiled, a single tear of gratitude slipping down her cheek as she listened to the old man's voice one last time. She turned off the recorder, stepped out onto her balcony, and looked over the thriving valley. She was no longer the broken girl left with a dry hole in the ground. She was the architect of a new legacy.